Found out about my ex-wife's affair the day she was hospitalized, and now, years later, she refuses to accept my engagement to my fiancée. If there were ever an award, I'd be a front-runner for the bad ways to find out your spouse is cheating. It would not take me long before I became a regular elected member of that club nobody never wanted to join. I will never forget the sound of my former sister-in-law's voice on the phone as she said over and over that she was sorry. I didn't know what she was talking about. Finally, after I calmed her down a little bit, she told me that my wife was in the hospital and I should come home. My brain was running full tilt, trying to get more information and at the same time avoid crashing as I raced home. All she told me was that it was an attack of sorts. Then she hung up and would not answer when I called back. Some background: I met my ex, the guy who posted the question, in our mid-20s at a mutual friend's barbecue. At first, she looked almost too good to be true. She not only was incredibly pretty, but also had a shyness that held her back, which was adorable. It took a while before we officially started dating, but when finally became possible, I was so happy. Granted, she did not like our first attempt at being intimate. She burst into tears all of a sudden. It made me feel horrified, like I'd done something wrong. But next day she texted and told me the truth. She triggered a flashback from her experience being involved with Chad. He told me that a full 2 years before meeting me, she had been in a long relationship with a guy who was there for 10 years. And when they were, emotionally, physically, or mentally abusive. Zas accumulated across the board during their intimacy nastily belittles her, but afterwards offers a heartfelt apology. She had a flashback, but assured me that it was nothing to do with me. Prior to us living together, take things slowly since she was still in therapeutic treatment. It was tough, but because I loved her, no sense in it for now, and none ever seemed one again, so. A year later we became engaged. The house about to be described was one we bought while engaged. Let me back up a little. It sure felt good to have a house with signal fire and phone service. I was fortunate enough because my uncle left me an inheritance since then to take us on. She thought that was a wonderful idea. Half kidding, I told her to go ahead and put wherever shells so grew instead of flowers. Now we can have a peach tree, metaphor for new beginning. We got married not long after that, and he says it was absolutely wonderful. Indeed, the marriage was not without its ups and downs and even pain. But I was grateful she advocated always clinging her man and tried never to go to bed angry with him if I ever did something that upset her. She gently pointed that out. Eventually, life happened and I was promoted at work. That meant getting more money, but also more travel for conferences and a whole lot of extra work except on planes, idling my time away in airports. I noticed she was down and not as intimate as before. From then on, she kept her phone close in hand, even stopped gently speaking things that displeased her. I talked to her about it, but she said everything would be all right once we passed through this phase. Having no reason not to believe her, I let the matter drop. Sometimes she would go visit her sister and stay all night with her, saying she needed some girl time. The day I got the fateful phone call, she was supposed to be staying again in her sister's company. I remember rushing to the hospital. I hardly could even breathe. Frantically, I kept asking about my wife, when the nicest and most understanding police officer sat me down like a father would with a child to explain what had happened. He said he was a friend of my sister-in-law and had responded to a domestic disturbance call. When he arrived, he found a couple fighting. The supposed boyfriend was on top of the woman, punching her while she screamed and struggled helplessly to break loose from him. This line of argument made no sense to me, since one, this had nothing to do with my wife because we were married, and two, everybody who knew my wife knew she would never do such a thing. "I'll tell you," the officer said, giving me a knowing look. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me to stay calm because the woman is actually my wife. If it hadn't been such a serious situation, I would have laughed in his face, but for some reason his manner made me believe him immediately. Then a nurse took me in to see my wife, and to this day, even now, I can hardly put into words how she looked. I just stood there, feeling as if I had been frozen in time, before a doctor hurried in and told me something about her injuries. Her jaw was slightly fractured. Her left eye was puffed out so swollen that you couldn't see any white at all underneath the lid. She had massive bruising covering half of her face, and more importantly, 3 broken ribs. The doctor dropped another bombshell: she was pregnant. It wasn't tea until my wife's sister caught sight of her that all of this finally came together in my head. When I first approached her, she tried to avoid me. However, her police officer friend finally gave her some encouragement, and she told me what she knew. As it turned out, my wife's ex had contacted her 5 months before. Intending some kind of extrication or salvation, he was making his way from place to place in order that he might gain redemption. He wanted absolution for past errors of judgment more than anything else. Does anybody else smell a rat? She began to associate more with him, and then he had her go out for a coffee so that women could see how much he had changed. Naturally, this resurrected former feelings, and since he seemed different, it soon became an emotional affair. My wife approached her sister for advice. She told her to take things slow and get it all out of her system if she wanted. It had only been too exciting. Then, 3 months later, a physical affair broke in on this idol. Even my sister-in-law said she was willing to take care of whatever bad habits paralegal work quit bars could have cost money owed to my sister-wife. My sister-in-law was crying now, saying she was sorry because she didn't know about the abuse my wife had gone through. It was only her and the psychologist who treated everything as tell daughter. I just stood there in shock. I couldn't believe any of it, but at the same time found myself completely nonplussed by my wife's actions. When my wife finally woke up, it was the wee, small hours of the night before, and EU was there for her. She burst out crying hot tears the instant she opened her eyes and saw me sitting by the bed alongside her. Last few months, living in a state of zombie. At the earnest insistence of her family's teaching us, we went to individual counseling first for her and then became a couple under one roof again. Don T asked how this is possible, despite the two of us seeing each other. In counseling, she was surprisingly open about how it all happened and just how much she hated herself for causing me pain. She once said that he can even change your heart because she was starting to think back then, however this makes sense. She said she wanted to break up, but was too weak to do so, and it wasn't until she was pregnant that she truly realized what he had done to her. That was when any further connection between her and this man turned itself into a poison for herself, as well as for the unborn child in her womb. It seemed as if there could never be another chance of getting free from him or his disciples altogether. So she went to finish off the affair with him. At the end, he cracked and hit her. Suddenly, she collapsed into a half-dead thing. She was afraid of men other than myself, as the remnants of her old self suffered for it. At one point, she couldn't even go to the bathroom alone at night without my holding her hand. It's so pitiful. Last October, I started receiving frequent phone calls from the planning and development department in my town, and kept feeling slightly irritated for having to rush down to City Hall 3 times in just 1 month for something different every time. But what these clingy friends Don T realize is that when one has children, both time and mood are precious commodities. Strive as best one may to help others, especially new acquaintances. These two things are not easy to come by. From his seclusion standpoint along the nearby riverbank below Bao Sunggun in Kangwon province centers, rather like Hong Kong or Singapore, always centered around ports, but a bit isolated from the cities by their own special industrial zones. A little sailor's joke, the irrepressible Mr. Yamada has finally emerged as a rich man. Having once inherited 1/5 of Honda Motors stock from his father, and thus able to laugh off living through long periods without food or clothing necessary for survival. In a land where 4 official seasons of plant life give work all year round, he once again hung out a shingle near Bundang. The best part of Wuchi, too, until recently, when there were orders for him to take down its mark altogether. Called her children S father, S surname. What was already short became shorter still. Now this is all right indeed. After the baby was born, a son, by the way, we got a paternity test and he was mine. But the more I hanged around her, the more I realized that I didn't actually hate my wife, but rather loathed her. I could no longer see the woman I married, but instead saw this abandoned remains. Every time I looked at her, I decided to leave, since it was not a question of if I would regret doing something which led to nothing in return, aside from hers and her abusive ex. She had begged me not to leave, making even ridiculous offers such as giving me a hall pass or letting myself slap her should I want to. I think she knew at this point that it was time for me to get out. She was actually very generous during the divorce proceedings, moving back in with her parents and signing a co-parenting plan which the courts had drawn for her fast-forward 3 years, and I meet my now fiancée purely by chance. One day I was in a bookstore with a friend of mine, talking about Egyptian mythology, when this beautiful woman came up to correct me on the pronunciation of names from ancient Egypt. Needless to say, I was highly impressed, not only by her knowledge, but also because she is Egyptian herself. We exchanged phone numbers, which led to dating eventually. When I finally asked her to marry me, it was in front of the peach tree that I had planted with my own hands some years ago. After I got down on bended knee, but before she could answer my question, she fled the house for a moment and returned carrying an engagement ring as well. It turned out that she had been planning to propose to me after all, because she was hopelessly head over heels in love with me and couldn't bear the thought of anyone else holding on to my heart. My son, in his gentle, innocent way, told my mother all that happened because he was around when it happened. My ex actually turned up in the rain that night, yelling about how I could ask my bride to marry me in front of our tree and that this doesn't mean it is over between us now. I am entirely worn out at this point. I can go no contact because she is the mother of my child, but she is basically harassing me and my fiancé. How do I get her to move on, to not be so terrified of men and not force me to ask a lot for one? Now on to the next story, story 2. My worst fears were realized when my wife had an affair with her boss. Background. I always believed I was a good husband, a good father, and a decent man. My wife and I had been married for 10 years, and we have 2 young boys. In 2020, I landed my dream job in the military and moved my family to Hawaii. We started what seemed like a perfect life on the tropical island. After 2 years without working, my wife got a government job, and I thought everything was going smoothly until she began spending time with her boss. Let us call him Rick. Starting in early to mid-2021, my wife started mentioning Rick more and more, almost like a giddy schoolgirl when she talked about him. I couldn't help but notice it, and one day I snapped and told her to stop bringing him up so much. I have had insecurities about infidelity from a previous relationship, and during our dating years, I made it clear to my wife that cheating was my biggest fear. So when I confronted her about her relationship with Rick, I expected her to understand and ease my concerns, but instead, she just took it as me wanting her to stop mentioning his name. After that, she only referred to Rick along with another female coworker. Let us call her Mel. Around the same time, I began experiencing heart problems due to stress and ended up in the hospital twice. I started having heart episodes whenever I got extremely anxious or worried, so I began staying home more often. In March, as my wife was approaching her 39th birthday, she became more down on herself and started going out for happy hours more frequently. She'd come home in a good mood, then sit and play on her phone saying that the happy hours helped her escape. Then, on April 22nd, out of nowhere, my wife became more interested in our sex life. We started having amazing sex and bonding, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We began sending each other flirty texts and going on more dates. In May 2022, I caught a glimpse of a text exchange between my wife and Rick. The message said, "I want to see your back tattoo." I confronted my wife about it, and she immediately broke down, sobbing and asking for forgiveness. I told her this was inappropriate and reminded her that ID had issues with Rick since 2021. She promised to go back to just being friends with him and to stop texting and flirting. Foolishly, I told her she could remain friends with him. I guess I felt like I needed to save face. But I noticed Rick activated disappearing messages that same day. From that point on, I couldn't fully trust her, but I hoped things would improve once we moved back to the mainland. In June, we moved from Hawaii back to the mainland US. We stayed with her parents until we found a new home. During that time, our sex life remained great. I got a new job that allowed me to work from home and spend more time on the house, and she found a job she enjoyed. Everything seemed to be going well. Trickle truth. On September 22nd, my wife confessed that she had an emotional affair with Rick. She told me that a week before we moved, she confessed her feelings for him during a happy hour. A week after the move, she called him and told him she loved him. He apparently reciprocated. They continued chatting over WhatsApp and Skype at work. When I checked her phone, I found that she had deleted all the messages and his contact information. I completely broke down, spiraling into a pit of despair. I knew this was coming. She apologized repeatedly and promised to work on rebuilding our marriage and trust. She said she couldn't just get over her feelings for him, but would do everything possible to move on. I could see her trying, but I also saw the pain she was in. To prove to her how devastated I was, I took a photo of her, thinking I could show it to her later. A few days later, I started having intense urges to disappear and felt totally suicidal. I began medication to help manage these feelings and started to regain some control. By mid-October, things seemed to be getting back to normal on the surface, but inside, I still felt inadequate, and my self-esteem was in the gutter. I was going through the motions with my wife, buying fireplaces and planning getaways. I still felt empty but thought I could push through. However, one evening, I noticed something was off with my wife again. She confessed that she had seen Rick in August. He had family in the area and visited her. She took time off work to meet him at a park. She claimed she needed to see him one last time and wanted to be in a public place without alcohol. They walked around the park the entire time, and when it was time to say goodbye, she got into his car and cheated on me further. She insisted they only made out and nothing more happened. Hearing this, I completely lost it. I cried and screamed harder than I ever had in my life. Our kids, who were asleep, were woken up by my outburst. I yelled at her, telling her she had crushed my heart and scarred our children. Once again, she apologized repeatedly and begged me not to leave. At the end of October, I was going through her emails, trying to piece together what had happened, and I found a hidden email with his phone number, titled Maybe. I confronted her again, and this time I was teetering on the edge of suicide, but thankfully didn't cross that line. She finally gave me the full truth, the truth I had asked for back in May and September. After that, she said she was completely over him and that any lingering feelings had disappeared. The pain I showed her seemed to snap her out of the affair as hold. Today, I've reported Rick to HR for showing preferential treatment and having an affair with my wife. I don't know what is going to happen next. My wife sent a note to his live-in girlfriend, telling her the truth about what happened. My hatred for him and the disrespect I feel is deep. Hawaii allows legal action against affair partners, and I am considering my options. I told my wife we can try to reconcile, but I haven't forgiven her, and I'm not sure I ever will. We've been more honest and possibly closer than ever, but the wounds are still fresh. We've started marriage counseling and individual therapy for my existing PTSD. I know this wasn't my fault, but looking back at the timeline, I wonder if I could have done something to prevent it. I know my wife loves me and she insists it was a mistake, but to me, a mistake is a single action, not a series of choices. I want to reconcile and I want to give it one more try, but I mourn and grieve every day. Edit. She told her family and friends, and they've all sided with me, offering support. I've also contacted Rick's partner, who confirmed most of the same story my wife told me. I've checked through prior phone records, and the timeline mostly matches up except for the WhatsApp messages that are now gone. My wife isn't very tech-savvy, so if she took any photos, they would be on our shared photo app, which automatically backs up to my account. I am planning to go to her work and check her message history on her computer, unannounced, to quell any remaining doubts. I might even pursue a polygraph test just to be sure. I am confident the affair ended by D-Day 3, but I am still trying to understand the full timeline. Or am I just going crazy?